getting ready to quilt my flag panel, and I've gathered my supplies. I have my panel. I'm going to baste it using the techniques I teach in my How to Baste a Quilt online class. I've gathered some Wonderfill threads, a 12 weight cotton, a 50 weight cotton, and an 80 weight for the bobbin. To quilt this panel, I'm going to use my walking foot to quilt some straight lines first, because I really like the heavy black line in between the red and white stripes. So I'm going to use a 12 weight cotton black to do a walking foot right over top of that printed stripe. But in the bobbin, I'm going to be using this tan deco bob, which is an 80 weight bobbin. I'm going to use this throughout the entire quilt, whether I'm using cream or red or black, because it's the basic color of everything that's in here. This is the, it's the color of the painted wood, and also this is a really thin bobbin, so it's going to blend in with anything. That's how I'm going to start. So I'm starting in the middle, and I am going to just stitch right over the selvage here. I have my stitch length set to 3 millimeters. I like a longer stitch, usually for my walking foot, but I really like a longer stitch with such a thick thread because it's going to bulk up more, and a short stitch would actually look kind of ridiculous. The thread would be wider than it is long. So at least 3 millimeters. I might even take it up to 3.5. Gloves make such a difference when you're pushing fabric, because you don't have to push down on it. Whenever you quilt, you want to push forward. You want to let the quilt move the way it wants to move. You don't want to push down. That stops the movement. I didn't make a knot when I started because that's going to be in the binding. I just sewed some lint in there. Let me grab that out. Quilting makes so much lint. Once I got to the end, I used the scissor button and cut this. So I have stitched on this line. I'm going to do the same thing for every line on the right half of this quilt. I've stitched all of the stripes on this side of the quilt, and then I rotated the quilt, so I'm now working on the new right half. I only like to have half the quilt inside of the machine at once, just to help eliminate the bulk here. I want to start stitching at the in the middle of the quilt here, at the stripe outside of this field of stars. Now, since this thread is so thick, I can't do a regular machine knot, because when I cut the thread, it won't bounce back. It'll stick up. It won't just suck into the quilt. So what I'm going to do is put my needle down, needle up, pull up my bobbin thread. So I have to have long tails. I have my top thread and bobbin thread together here. And I am going to do just a quick back and forth, just one stitch, maybe two, and then continue on down. Get that thread is stuck in my foot. The thread is really stuck in my foot. There we go. And stitch right off the end of the quilt again, but I'm not going to use my knot button. What I'm going to do is cut the top and cut the bottom. And the reason I'm doing that is I need the long tails to start so that I have something up here. So what I'm going to do with these tails is I'm going to grab a needle with a big eye, since this is a thick thread. 12 weight is a really thick thread. So I'm going to grab a needle. There, I threaded the ends through the needle, and I am just going to bury the ends. It's already knotted. So I'm tucking the needle in between the layers of the quilt, and I'm going to pull it up over here. Anywhere, doesn't really matter. I'm going to pull it out and just trim it. So the ends are sucked in, and then I won't have any little ends sticking up on my quilt, giving me little fuzzies. So I'm going to do this exact same thing on all of these stripes on the right hand side, and I'm going to come back and do the same thing right here to outline the field of stars, making the same knots. So I'm going to make a knot in the corner and stitch along here after I finish stitching all of these going down. I finished all my stitch in the ditch, covering up the black stripes in between the red and white stripes, as well as outside of the field of stars. I've now rethreaded my machine in the top, and I'm using a 50 weight taupe thread that I'm going to quilt in both the red and the white because they all have specks of this taupe in it, and I think it'll blend nicely. I then marked lines across my quilt at 1 3/4 inches, which is approximately making squares going across. And what that's going to do is help me do my free motion quilting and make it look even. I'm going to make a knot in the corner. Needle down, needle up, pull up the bobbin thread. And I'm going to take a couple small stitches. This thread I probably will just cut because it's a much thinner thread and it won't stick out and give me the feeling of little porcupine bristles. So what I'm going to do in each of these squares is stitch a star. And a star is, it's like a teacher star like you got on your papers when you were in grade school. So I'm going to do a diagonal line to about the top middle here and then back down to the corner. I've made a hoop with my hands and I'm going to be pressing the fabric left and right, but I'm not going to be pressing it down. And I am going to slow my machine down. So I just made the point. I'm going to speed the machine up a little bit. Whenever I free motion quilt, I press my foot pedal all the way to the ground and let the machine stay at one speed. So I'm adjusting it up on the slider bar in my machine. Now I'm going to do a diagonal line up backwards to the middle of the line here. I'm going to go all the way across here. And back down to the beginning. So that's my star. I'm going to do a little fake stitch in the ditch here, and I'm going to make another one. Stop after each one, shake out your hands, breathe, relax your shoulders, do what you need to do, and then go stitch another star. So kind of a free motion stitch in the ditch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm intentionally making all my stars a little bit different because matching isn't my goal. This is a really rustic, folk arty looking panel, and I'm going to quilt it that way. end here, I have a choice. I can ignore and choose to cut my quilt off here so I have an even number of squares, or I can stitch a partial star, which is what I'm going to do. It will get cut off and I will bind over it. So I have a row of stars stitched on my quilt. I'm going to stitch stars. Oh, here, let me come back and trim this. I don't have to bury those. It's a much thinner thread. I am going to stitch stars in every red stripe going across my quilt. In every white stripe, however, I'm going to stitch swirls. So I'm going to make my knot in the middle of that one of the side, in the middle of the square, take a couple stitches, and I'm going to make a swirl. And I'm going to choose to go clockwise for the first one, and swirl my way in, and trace it badly on the way back out. Perfection is not the goal. I'm going to go over it again, and now I'm going to swirl counterclockwise. And repeat. Whenever I need to stop, I either stop in the middle, between the swirls, or I stop once I've swirled once. So if I need to stop, I'll work my way in and pause, shake out my hands, scratch my nose, whatever I need to do. And work my way back. I can stop there, or I can stop here. And I'm going to stitch these swirls going all the way down in every white stripe. And like I did with the stars, I'm going to do a partial star out here, knowing I'm going to bind over it. Like I said, I'm going to stitch stars in every red stripe, and I'm going to stitch swirls in every white stripe throughout the stripes on the flag. Now that I've finished all of the stripes, I want to stitch some diagonal cross hatching between the stars. I considered switching to blue thread, but I think I'm going to stay with the taupe thread I've been using. With a chalk marker, I just drew some lines kind of in the middle of each of the stars, and I'm going to see how I can do this with my walking foot. I've set my stitch length to 3 millimeters, and this is a little project, so I'm going to try to do this without that many knots. So with it being a little project, I'm going to turn it. Stitch in the ditch a couple stitches and turn it again. If this were a large quilt, I would probably stitch each of these lines independently with a knot at the end of them, but with such a small project, I don't think I'm going to bother. What's great about this being a rustic, folk art, primitive type panel is that if it's not straight, that's absolutely fine. This becomes kind of a game. I'm like, ooh, can I do this all with one knot, or will I have to start again somewhere else? I think I'm glad I just stayed with the taupe thread. I like it. Stitching exactly on the chalk line, which is fine because the chalk line's going to go away. Continue stitching it this way until all of the cross hatching is done in the star field. Now that the quilting is finished, I'm going to bind it according to the directions I give in my How to Bind a Quilt class.